Okay, it is beyond question that that is what this is. Okay, now the question, of course, is it actually Jesus, of course, right, is the bigger question. And we'll get to that in a moment. The most reasonable explanation for this photograph is that it pictures Jesus in the tomb, a photograph that occurred the moment he rose from the dead. The photograph looks to have been produced by an energy source unknown to modern science. Energy coming from inside the body itself, and energy that is said to have been released when the body of Jesus was transformed from a dead body into a living body with far different qualities than it had previously. There is no known scientific explanation for how the image on the shroud was formed, or even how it could have been formed. So, if it's a clever hoax, they have no idea how this could have been done. Because, and I'll show a picture here to the folks playing the home game on YouTube. This is the picture of the shroud. There's an image you can kind of see. And then this picture over here, the darker one that's more clear, shows it's more like the negative. A negative of that picture, so you can see it more sharply in the negative, okay, than you can through regular means. Okay. There's also, here's the full picture. That was just of the head. This is a picture of the full length, and you can kind of see the details there. You can see the wounds on Jesus in this. You can kind of see, like on his wrist, you can see there's a hole there on the wrist. You can see there's on his side, there's a wound, and down by his ankles there's also a wound, and you can kind of see stuff around his head that there's wounds there. That is consistent with what we know of Roman crucifixions of that time period. Right? This is consistent with Roman crucifixion. So it's very, very likely that this is a person who was crucified, okay, from what we can tell just from the image. Now remember, all four Gospels say that a linen cloth was used to wrap the body of Jesus after crucifixion. And I'm just going to look at Luke 23 real quickly here. Luke 23 verses 50 to 56 says this. Now there was a man named Joseph from the Jewish town of Arimathea. He was a member of the council, that's the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin, the 70 elders, the Jewish ruling people of Israel. Okay, so this is nobody. He's an important man. He was a good and righteous man who had not consented to their decision and action. So he did not cast his vote in favor of crucifying Jesus. He said no to that. And he was looking for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then he took it down and wrapped it in a linen shroud and laid him in a tomb cut in stone where no one had ever yet been laid. It was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. Okay, so Luke mentions a linen shroud being used by Joseph of Arimathea to wrap the body of Jesus. And remember, as we've talked about already before, about St. Luke in particular, how is he for recording detail accurately? He's a stickler for detail, right? He is very accurate, very consistent with what he records. Remember, we talked about how the different names that he gives for the different rulers, not only in Jerusalem, but outside in Acts and in Paul's missionary journeys, and he got every single one of them exactly correct. So he is a stickler for detail, okay? And he says, there's a linen shroud. So that's a good indication that he's probably right. But let's see what the other ones say. Matthew 27, 57 to 60. When it was evening, there was a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who also was a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him, and Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut in the rock, and he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb and went away. So again, a clean linen shroud. So this was a new clean linen shroud. It wasn't just, oh, I got this towel that I just showered with this morning, and I'm just going to go use that and wrap Jesus in it. No. This was a clean, brand new linen shroud. Okay. What does Mark say? Remember, Mark is Peter's account of the gospel. Mark says, "And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And Joseph bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock, and he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb." So, we're getting a pretty consistent story here so far. Who's the one who's taking Jesus down from the cross and putting him in a tomb? Same guy, Joseph of Arimathea. And he's always bringing with him a linen shroud, right? But notice they're not exactly identical, right? There's differences in details. Each author is giving us little bit different details, little bit different information about what's happening, but it's all completely consistent, right? And this is what detectives, by the way, investigating cases, this is what they look for. They don't want it all to be strictly identical, because if a story is completely identical, what do they know has gone on immediately? It's collusion automatically. They've talked to each other. They figure this out. Okay, so it's suspect at that point. Here, the stories are all the same. The main details are all the same, but there's also added little bits of different information, different ways of phrasing it, and whatnot that lends credibility to each of these being distinct, separate stories, but all saying the same thing, right? This is actually very important for Christianity. John says something else here too. Oops, I had it and then I lost it. John 19:38. "After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took away his body. Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there." Again, slight difference in details, right? And yet, all the things are consistent. All the big points are the same, right? Linen shroud. So, why should we believe that this artifact is genuine? Why should we think that? Well, as Secondo Pia, he was the first man to photograph the shroud in 1898. That was his name, Secondo Pia. He photographed the shroud for the very first time in 1898. As he was developing his negatives, he was amazed to see a positive image emerge from his film. A negative of a negative photograph gives a positive image. Sounds like algebra, right. Negative plus negative equals a positive, right? Something like that. Okay. Since it would have been impossible to fake a photographic negative long before the world had any knowledge of photography, there can be no doubt that the shroud contains an actual negative and actual photograph. Therefore, the allegation that the shroud is a painting or a fake of some kind is known to be false. And that's what it often was first claimed. Okay, it's a really good fake, somebody painted it. But if it was a painting, why is there a photographic negative on the shroud? Okay, how could that be? And how could a photographic negative of the shroud be on a shroud before photography was ever invented? Right? Because this guy's the first guy to photograph it. At the end of the night, when did photography first come about?
In the 1800s.
In the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, it first started. So, I mean, and this shroud has been housed in Turin, Italy for many, many hundreds of years. Okay? So it's not like it just showed up in 1898 and this guy just decided to photograph it. No. This has been there for a long, long time. And he was just the first one to ever photograph it. Okay? So this is interesting. The image on the shroud demonstrates that the person was crucified with nails through the wrists, not hands. Right? It was not until 1902 that it became known that the flesh in a person's hands cannot bear the weight necessary for crucifixion without some sort of washers being used, which Romans could do as well. They would have like olive wood washers. They would put the spike through that washer first and then could put it through, and then it would hold it better. Okay? That's possible. But they might also just decide to put it through the wrists. Okay? Hold the body better that way. Okay? For that reason, nails were often driven through the wrists. This means that the shroud is historically accurate regarding the practice of crucifixion, even though all the paintings and other works of art of the crucifixion made during the Middle Ages and up until the 20th century are inaccurate in this regard. Where do they all show the nails of Jesus? In his hands. In the palms of his hands. They do not show it in the wrists. Every single piece of art depicting the crucifixion of Jesus from the Middle Ages up into the 20th century shows Jesus being crucified that way. So if this was, again, a forgery, a clever forgery of later times, why would they put it through the wrists and not through the hands? Makes you wonder. Okay. So the shroud is quite accurate in that regard. Note that the Greek and Aramaic words for hands can also refer to wrists. Okay, so when you read the New Testament and it says they nailed him through his hands, that same word in Greek can be used for wrists. Okay, so it's not like the Bible is wrong here. Okay, it's just a different way of interpreting that same word. Okay? Now, the energy source for the photograph must have come from within the body itself. Why do we think this? One reason being that there are no shadows on the photograph as would have happened with external lighting. Right? What do you always have to watch for with photography, right? Shadows, right? You got to watch for that. And depending on the angle that you take, sometimes you need to bring in extra lights and all that kind of stuff, right, to get a clear photograph, right? We still have to do this today. It's just the way it is. It's the way it works, right? Now that's very, very interesting. Another indication that the light source came from the body itself is the fact that the shroud contains the body image from both the front and back and sides. So it's clear that the energy source that left this negative image on the shroud came from within the body itself. It's not external going onto the shroud, it's internal coming from the other direction. The body is the source of light. That's why they're saying they have no idea what the energy source is for this. There's no known energy source that could do this. To this day, we don't know. Okay? So it's something supernatural, we would say. Right? It's supernatural. We do not understand how this could be. Scientifically speaking, I should argue. We know how it can be, right? Because we know who is the source of that light and that energy is none other than God himself, and he could do that. Okay. How, we're not quite sure, but he could certainly do it, right? So because the shroud contains the body image from both the front and back and sides, external lighting could not have made such a photograph. It doesn't work. Can you take a photograph of somebody's front and back at the same time? No, you can't do it. So, and since he was wrapped in the shroud, it all came from within, right? And they can tell by the wrappings of the shroud and how this all happened. Okay. Close inspection of the image on the shroud reveals that it is an X-ray image as well as a photographic image. Now, isn't that interesting? Skeletal features can be observed. Again, the energy source for the image must have come from within the body, and the source of this energy has no known scientific explanation, which strongly suggests that the energy that produced the image was supernatural. But it's not saying that it's fake. It's saying that we just don't understand how. Scientifically, there's no explanation for this. Doesn't mean that it's wrong or anything. We just don't know how it could be scientifically. Another interesting point is that Middle East pollen grains on the shroud, which match certain plant-bearing flowers also pictured on the shroud, are from plants that exist in and around Jerusalem. So there's further evidence. In this linen shroud, there are grains, pollen grains. And what kind of pollen grains are these? Well, they just happen to be from flowers and plants that exist in and around Jerusalem. So we know the origin of this shroud then, right? The identified flowers from these plants are known to bloom in the springtime, the time of Jesus' crucifixion. Isn't that a coincidence, right? These clearly identified plants are found as a group only in and around Jerusalem, nowhere else in the world. Isn't that fascinating? As I was reading this was like, oh my goodness, I had no idea there was so much evidence tied to the Shroud of Turin. Yes, Cheryl.
Could that be almost the opposite of photosynthesis? What happened because of the energy field?
I think the reason why those pollen grains are on the shroud is because of the spices and the flowers and stuff that the body would have been wrapped with. Also from the fact they're dragging his body through what location? As John said, a garden, right? So in the garden, if there was wind blowing or anything, these pollen grains could have been blown onto the shroud, or as they were carrying the body through the garden, they brushed up against plants and flowers. These pollen grains and stuff would have been become attached to the linen shroud. And I think that's how that happened. Especially if, as you can imagine, this linen shroud would not have been clean and dry after Jesus' body was wrapped in it, right? What would have been covering this linen shroud? Blood. A lot of blood, right? I mean, he was bleeding profusely, we know, when he died, right? So they take him down, and there would be blood all over his body as they wrapped him in the shroud. So that would soak through, which then would make it easier for pollen grains and other things like that to stick to the linen, right? So I find this just absolutely fascinating. That's a possibility. Okay. How much time do we have? 10 minutes. Do you think we can get through this in 10 minutes? Let's see. Written records of the Sudarium of Oviedo, that is the linen cloth that was used to cover Jesus' head from the time of his death to his burial, so named because it is stored at the Camera Santa, the Holy Chamber in Oviedo, Spain. The written records of this, they would have had two cloths. Okay, the linen shroud that would have wrapped Jesus' body, and then a separate cloth that would have wrapped around his head. Okay, two different things. This one goes back to 1st century and to Jerusalem. That's how far back this one is traced. The Gospel of John states that two cloths, apparently the shroud and the sudarium, were seen left in the tomb after the resurrection. Look at John 20, verses 6 and 7. Okay. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head was not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. So there's two distinct wrappings. Okay? As one pastor put it one time, it's interesting, what's the first thing that Jesus did when he rose from the dead on Sunday morning? He made his bed. He folded up his pillow and everything, and left it neatly, just like Mary had no doubt taught him to do. Okay, as a young boy. It's very interesting, right? So scientific study of these two linen cloths has revealed that they are stained with the same blood type, and the stains are the same shapes and are in the same places on both cloths. So you probably would have had a linen cloth first that would have been wrapped around Jesus' head, okay, his face and his head. And then the larger linen shroud would have been wrapped over the whole body, including the head. Okay, so there would have been two wrappings, but would have gone all around him, and then one specifically for his head. Whether that was, I don't like, out of respect, for the dead. We close people's eyes when they die, things like, maybe that's why. I'm not entirely certain, but it probably was a burial custom of the people of the time. Okay, and that's why they did things that way. So it's really interesting that the blood stains are in exactly the same places on both cloths, which shows that there's probably a connection there, right? There is no image on the sudarium, however, even though it was lying in the tomb along with the shroud. It likely would have been removed when the larger linen cloth was used to cover the body. Oh, so maybe that's why. Maybe as they were transporting it, they had wrapped his head in this cloth, and then when they got him to the tomb, they unwrapped that and then put the full shroud over him at that point. That could be what it was. Okay. Some of the pollen grains on the shroud are from a plant that grows in Palestine and is known for its sharp thorns. Those pollen grains are especially numerous around the head of the image on the shroud, apparently left there by the crown of thorns. Isn't that interesting? We actually know from the shroud that the thorny vines were formed into the shape of a cap, not a crown. So it wouldn't have just been like a singular line around his head. It would have been like a cap that went all the way onto his head. And remember, these are thorns that are like inches long. These are not little ones like we have around here. These are 2 to 3 inch long thorns. This is not a pleasant experience.
When we see a picture of them, we don't see that cap. We only see that.
We only see the. I know we do. I know. Isn't that interesting? And again, that's all the artwork shows it that way, right? And yet the evidence we have from the Shroud of Turin would suggest otherwise. And really, if you think about it, it might have been easier for them to hack off the thorns the way that they would all be, because thorns are a tangled mess, right? I mean, they don't come out in perfectly nice little strings that you can then form into a wreath, right? They probably would have hacked off a segment and then said, oh yeah, that's about the right size, and then smoosh right down on his head, right? And let the thorns keep it there. So that actually makes more sense in some regard, right? For what the soldiers did.
But a lot of pictures that we see, this evidence wouldn't have been around when those pictures were.
Oh, exactly. No, they would have had no idea. No, you're right.
You wouldn't see the cap then.
You're right, exactly. So it makes sense, right? They didn't have this evidence at the time. They wouldn't have known. So the thorns and vines covered the top of the head as well as the temples and the sides. As mentioned above, the sudarium and the shroud have separate histories, but the blood type and pattern of blood stains and other bodily fluids all match. For this reason, it's evident that we have two independent but complementary sets of historical records that confirm the authenticity of the shroud. Bruise marks that are a perfect match for those left by a Roman flagrum, that's the whip used to scourge criminals, are evident on the shroud as well. These scourge wounds are clearly seen on the back, front, and thighs of the victim of the crucifixion. Bruises on the side of the man's face also match the description of how Jesus was beaten before being crucified. Right? Remember, Jesus went through several beatings from Thursday night to Friday afternoon. Right? He was beaten up by the guards of the Sadducees. Right? They struck him several times. Then he was beaten by Pilate's guards, and he was even flogged by Pilate's guards. This is the use of the flagrum. That's the thing with the sharp bone and metal things attached to the leather cords. So when they struck the back or the legs or wherever it struck a victim, they would dig in, and then when the guy pulled it back, the flesh would be ripped out with it. It was a way of almost like flaying somebody alive. Okay? And people who were beaten with that did not always survive the beating. Okay? That's how horrific it was.
By his stripes
We are healed. Right, exactly. So this is seen in John 18, 21 to 22. We see that, as well as John 19, 1 to 3. So I'll just read John 19 here. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. So the bruises, the wounds that we see on this image, on this shroud, match exactly the description of the beating that Jesus received according to the gospel records. It's a perfect match. Okay? The man pictured on the shroud had been scourged before he was crucified. And this, by the way, was not the common practice in Roman crucifixions. Why would they whip someone they were about to kill? That would only weaken him and not make it last as long. And that was the whole thing about crucifixion. It took days to die. That was part of the punishment. It was a slow, suffering death to serve as a warning to other criminals. That's the way the Romans liked it. So why would they beat him ahead of time, knowing that that's going to weaken him and make his death come more quickly? It doesn't make sense. Okay, except, of course, we know that Jesus was scourged by Pilate in the hope that the crowd would have pity on him so Pilate could let him go. Right? That's what Pilate was trying to do. He was trying to drum up pity from the crowd so that he could let Jesus go. Didn't work, though. Okay? In addition, the man pictured on the shroud had been crowned with a cap of thorns. There's no other record of a crucified man being crowned with thorns. In addition, the crucified man had been stabbed by a lance on the right side. The nature of the lance used to make such a stab wound matches the lances that were common issue for Roman soldiers. We see this in John 19, 33 to 34. Where it says, "But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water." Why did they stab him with the spear? To make sure he was dead. Because if he wasn't dead and they let him go, whose life was forfeit? The Roman soldiers. They ain't stupid, okay? It's what they talk about in sometimes in military terms of the double tap, right? You make sure a person's dead. You shoot him in the head again, once or twice, right? I mean, that's what they do to be sure that someone's not just playing dead or mostly dead and might recover. You make sure that they're dead. So this is what the Roman soldiers did too. Suffice it to say that the chances of any other man killed by Roman crucifixion matching all these details are extremely remote. Again, when we talked about our apologetics study, is it possible that there was another man who went through all of this the same that Jesus did? Is it possible? It's possible. Is it probable? No, it's not probable. And we deal with probability, not possibility, right? We deal with what's probable. What is most likely? Okay, so the man pictured on a shroud may most reasonably assumed to be Jesus of Nazareth. Now the big question that comes up, and this is what I wanted to get to before we finish. The big question that comes up is, what about a carbon-14 dating test that suggests the cloth from the shroud only goes back to the 14th century? A review of that test indicates that the piece of cloth taken to be used for the test was taken from a corner of the shroud that had been spliced on the main cloth to repair damage from a fire. Why they took it from that for the carbon-14 test, I don't know. That seems really silly to do something like that. But that's what they did. There is no reasonable evidence to doubt this, so there is no reasonable evidence to conclude that the shroud is anything but genuine. Okay, because they know the shroud was damaged in a fire in the late 13th, early 14th century. So what do they do with it then? They repair it as best they can. But where would they've gotten linen from that time? Well, from their own time period, obviously. So of course the carbon dating would match the 14th century. Now you might say, well, why haven't they just done another carbon 14 dating test? Well, because this is such an important relic, they don't want any part of it to be further damaged, because to take you have to cut a piece out and destroy it in order to do the carbon 14 test. And they don't want to damage this artifact anymore. So they're saying, no, we're not going to do it. Okay, they're not allowing that to happen. Because of the scientific evidence for the authenticity of the shroud, several skeptical scientists and other scholars who were part of the initial scientific study of the shroud converted to Christianity. Isn't that interesting? In keeping with what St. Paul says in Romans 1:16, should this really surprise us? What does Romans 1:16 say? I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So this evidence served as powerful testimony to those scientists of the truthfulness of the gospel. And the Holy Spirit used that to create faith in their hearts. Amazing. That is perhaps the greatest miracle of all, out of all these things, right? This is astounding. This should not surprise us, as the shroud appears to contain an actual photograph of the moment Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. I had no idea when I first started looking into this that the Shroud of Turin had this much evidence to back it up. To be honest with you, I really didn't. I thought, well, maybe. It's a possibility. But when you take all of this evidence together and combine it, man, that is powerful evidence to consider. It's really powerful testimony. So that's why I wanted to share this particular piece of evidence with you, because it is so astounding, and it's something that most people have heard of, right? Most people, even if they're not Christians, they've probably heard of the Shroud of Turin somewhere, in something, somehow, and now you can maybe have a point of contact with them and say, oh, let's talk about the Shroud of Turin. Let me tell you a little bit about it. It's quite interesting, right? So it's kind of cool. We won't get into the questions for this today. We'll close there. We'll get into the questions next week and dig into the next section as well. Question, sir? Yes?
I know it's late.
And I'm
Woe be to me if you want to hold us up. I don't mean to hold anybody up. But you mentioned something about as a play on the word that as Jesus' mother taught him to make his bed.
Right.
But if you think about it for just a second, that those clothes were folded up and that the face piece was folded